Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeVelco. I have the good fortune of directing our Environmental Change and Security Program and welcome you all to the Wilson Center today. It is our very good fortune that the American Red Cross and WWF were interested in launching what I think is really a real contribution, the Green Recovery and Reconstruction Training Toolkit for Humanitarian Aid, the GERT as it's being called, at the Wilson Center. So it was a thrill when Anita Van Breda and Judy Oglethorpe got in touch, and we had various conversations about how we might effectively convene an audience and have the real experts who've worked very hard on this product. You can see immediately that it's the sum of lots of insight and lots of work, and so it's a thrill for us here at the Wilson Center to be part of today. A word about the center, and then we'll jump into the program. The Wilson Center is actually the former memorial to Woodrow Wilson. Congress decided that it would be appropriate to have a memorial where it could reflect his two legacies as scholar and politician. He was our only president to have a PhD. So on a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis is exactly what we've tried to do since 1968 when Congress founded the Wilson Center. Our Environmental Change and Security Program is a little younger program. We were founded in 1994, trying to bring together some of the worlds that we have here in the room today, trying to understand how environmental and development, health, population issues connect to development policy, foreign policy, security policy. And so many of the issues that we'll touch on today go across those different worlds, and I think that's the partnership that we see that came together to do this is an explicit recognition and a practical response to different communities needing to talk with one another, get out of their silos, and learn from one another and find ways that they can improve their respective endeavors and then work together. So it's a real tribute to the team that has put this together today. And so we're gonna have the launch of the GERT. And we have a very distinguished lineup. I'll introduce them very briefly, although because you have bios that we handed out, I will not read them extensively because, as I said, it's quite a distinguished bunch. But in the order that we will hear from them, Roger Lowe is a Senior Vice President of Communications at American Red Cross. As an Ohioan, I jumped down immediately to the bio, where a lot of time at Columbus and the Columbus Dispatch. He's a longtime journalist and communications expert, so it's terrific to have Roger join us. I just learned Marcia is also an Ohioan. It's a bit of a conspiracy here. Marcia is the Chief Operating Officer at WWF and oversees WWF strategy, guiding work in policy markets, field conservation, and notably for today, the executive lead on the CARE WWF partnership, and so it's WWF Alliance, excuse me. So reflecting this importance of bringing these two different worlds together. Erika Clesceri from USAID is a Bureau Environment Officer and really working on bringing these things together. We've had she and WWF Aid and WWF hosted a session earlier this week where we're really trying to take practical steps of getting these communities together. So it'll be terrific to hear from Erika as how USAID is both a user and a recipient of these insights, but also clearly contributing to them. And so it's great that Erika could join us. Robert Laprade is a Senior Director for Emergencies and Humanitarian Assistance at CARE. He also was Program Director for the American Red Cross Tsunami Recovery Program, somebody who has years and years and years in the field dealing with disaster response and bringing these issues together. So it'll be terrific to hear from him. And then last but certainly not least, Peter Walker is the Director of the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University and the Rosenberg Professor of Nutrition and Human Security. Like Bob, somebody many, many years in the field, multiple different settings, really has that kind of both deep understanding in specific places, but also helps us draw lessons across these different cases. So final word before I ask Roger to come up would just be to say that we are webcasting today's event live. So if you're watching online, you can pull out the PowerPoints that should be loaded there right next to the link, so it can be easier for you to follow along there. It means for us in the room very little, except that when it comes to the Q&A time, I ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a microphone so the folks online can hear. And then finally, if online you'd like to pose a question that we can put into the discussion, just email that to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. If you do it early in the program, we can try to get it into the discussion. So Roger, please, sir, the floor is yours. I think if we... is one of those yours by any chance?
I don't have it.
Oh, nope. Okay, my apologies.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the American Red Cross as the Red Cross and the World Wildlife Fund launch our Green Recovery and Reconstruction Toolkit. What I'm struck by as we've gathered here today is it seems like this is almost a reunion of so many people who have done such great work on the tsunami recovery project. Some have moved on to other things, but it's a great chance to sort of reconnect and memorialize the great work that's been done by both of these groups in partnership, as working with other groups as well. The toolkit that we're launching today is a culmination of a partnership that started, as we've discussed, in the aftermath of the tsunami nearly 6 years ago. And that's when we formed with the American Red Cross Tsunami Recovery Program, formed this innovative 5-year partnership with WWF to help survivors rebuild their communities and the natural environments in which they depend. This partnership combines the environmental expertise of WWF with the international humanitarian aid expertise of the American Red Cross, and together we worked across the tsunami-affected regions to make sure that recovery programs included environmentally sustainable considerations in order to facilitate a long-lasting, safe, and green recovery for beneficiaries. Our shared goal was to ensure that recovery and reconstruction activities both maintain and enhance healthy ecosystems. Our partnership in this toolkit and this training program are based on the shared principle that environmental sustainability is critical to the achievement of long-lasting disaster recovery results. We believe things like shelter reconstruction, livelihoods recovery, water, sanitation, and disaster risk reduction must actively address environmental sustainability in order to ensure the communities and the natural resources upon which they depend are not put at further risk because of the unintended consequences of the disaster recovery process. So whether it's a tsunami, an earthquake, floods, or typhoons, we know that disasters wreak havoc. And the rebuilding effort that follows represents a significant and an important opportunity to rebuild communities that are more environmentally and socially sustainable than what existed, in fact, before the disaster occurred. Humanitarian aid and conservation practitioners, government officials, local communities, and donor organizations can all take specific steps to ensure that reconstructed communities are built back safer through actively addressing environmental sustainability, reducing risk and vulnerability to future disasters. Unfortunately, there are times, we all know, that the infusion of large amounts of resources to rebuild communities and get people back to work, however well-intentioned, can generate greater environmental degradation and increase community vulnerability to future disasters if not designed and implemented to account for local environmental conditions. To mitigate these potential negative effects, the Red Cross utilized the technical expertise of WWF to evaluate the environmental effects of tsunami recovery and reconstruction activities to provide alternative solutions. And we've had some great successes. I want to highlight just one for you today. In Krun-Sabi, the Watershed Forum was a successful integration that led to the reduction of future risk and vulnerability for beneficiaries. And it did this by protecting the water source for a Red Cross water supply project. The American Red Cross facilitated the reconstruction of the coastal town of Shillong on the west coast of Aceh with the construction of a drinking water supply project for its 7,000 inhabitants. And in order to protect the water source upstream of this project, WWF, with Red Cross support, organized the KS Watershed Forum. There are a handful of notable results from this community forum that I wanted to mention. First, there was increased understanding of the need for action to protect the environment and the watershed of the 10 communities and villages. There's been a decline in illegal logging. There's been improved water quality. There have been reductions in contamination of the river, which is the drinking water supply, so that's a really good thing, from mercury used for gold mining and processing in the region. There's been adoption of community regulations protecting the environment by a local authority. These regulations cover watershed protection, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and a series of sanctions for violations. The KS Watershed Forum is protecting and improving the physical environment, and there's a strong example of regreening there as well. Local residents have planted bamboo and other native tree species. In addition, 5,500 forest trees have been planted to help the forest, and 1,700 fruit trees have been planted in 10 communities. We've seen organic home gardening, which ensures that no hazardous chemicals are released into the environment, and women's groups are forming to encourage husbands to stop unnecessary tree cutting. Families in the watershed are now able to produce vegetables and fruits and sell any extra produce to generate additional family income. Our toolkit has been informed by the expertise of this partnership, as well as over 30 international authors and experts who have contributed to its content. It is based on the premise that human well-being and the ecosystem well-being are, in fact, interconnected. The toolkit and the training are designed to equip field staff working in humanitarian aid, government, and conservation with practical, solution-oriented techniques for integrating environmental sustainability into international disaster recovery and reconstruction. It's made up of 10 modules. If you see it outside, it is this thick. So it's got a lot of content broken into chunks and pieces that people can use as applies best to them. It covers project design, monitoring and evaluation, impact assessment tools and techniques, strategic site selection and development, key concepts of construction such as the materials supply chain, water and sanitation, livelihoods, and green organizational operations. Each module includes a trainer's guide, training materials for workshops, PowerPoint slides, technical content paper, and additional resources for future learning. We believe that this toolkit will help make communities stronger and more resilient by making environmental issues an integral process of the recovery process. It worked following tsunami, and it's working in other places around the world, and we think it can be extended even more. The American Red Cross is very, very proud of our partnership with WWF on this project, and it gives me pleasure to turn the podium over to Marcia.
Thank you, Roger. Likewise, this is like a family reunion. I'm looking at Jerry and Bob and others that have been involved in this, and Lisa. This has been an incredible effort and marriage between organizations that have different operating styles, different approaches to situations, and I think we've come up with something that is a marvelous integration of all the skills and capabilities of ourselves and our partners. One of the things that may not be known about WWF is that we work with communities every single day. You think about wildlife in our name, but we live in the places where we work for decades. So we join with those communities, we live with them, and when there's an opportunity or a disaster, like the one that was experienced through the tsunami, those are our communities that we live shoulder to shoulder with. So given the remarkable generosity of the Red Cross to allow us to come together and the substantial funding to build this program, we were able to do something that gave back immediately with some of the projects that Roger referenced, but also this toolkit is going to allow us to give back to many other communities, and I'll give you a sense of how this has already rippled out. It's one of the things that I love about this, and Roger mentioned, is that it's very solutions-oriented and practical. It's not a thou shalt not approach to disaster relief and recovery. It's more, here are things with the urgency that you have and the immediacy of decision-making that you can call upon to create very practical approaches with communities that are going to not only deal with a current situation, but leave them more resilient and less vulnerable going forward, and provide tools that communities then can adapt and engage in and build going forward. And so it's quite a vital project. I thought before I launched in that I might give a few thanks to some specific people out there on the WWF side. I've been called upon, like Roger, to represent a team, but did nothing more than show up on occasion for the review team with Jerry and ask key questions of our team members. But I'd like to introduce Anita Von Breda, who you'll see in the video here, who's led this effort for the years that we've been here and making multiple trips out to the region, working with the teams and our partners across the area, and really being the remarkable sort of spirit, force, and drive for this from our side. And then John Randall, who's sitting by Elisa, is the individual who shepherded the production of the GERT, love that name, and for the last 18 months and brought together all the partners and collaborators. So I'm sure there's no one more grateful to see that product wrapped up into the binder out there than John is right now. His eyes are glazing over from all those pages. We also work not only with our WWF colleagues and ARC colleagues around the world, so in Indonesia and Thailand, but with the Environmental Foundation in Sri Lanka and IUCN. So other partners there that were incredibly valuable to us in making these things happen. I mentioned practical solutions oriented, so I'm going to pick on two examples that are a little different from the one that Roger had. Although I would say, in addition, on the Watershed Forum, one of the things that we thought was so intriguing about that solution was we had previous Free Aceh rebels that were part of that Watershed Forum and joined in the community and came together in ways that they hadn't before given prior conflict. So it was really intriguing that with a bit of a conflict resolution angle into that one as well. So I thought I'd take two examples, one working on solid waste and sanitation issues in Sri Lanka, and in looking at a circumstance that could lead to really significant health issues, or we could look at some practical solutions that might turn things around. So we worked on, with women's groups there, on home gardening, teaching them to how to compost, how to deal with organic waste. And what was quite remarkable, and we had a chance to see before and after pictures during the course of our review, so it was really great, as if we were there and had a chance to experience initial community efforts and then how those have taken off. And that home gardening took off significantly to the point where the community Matara in Sri Lanka was posting signs that we are a no plastic community. And, you didn't see that waste as you walked around there. And the gardens came on strong, leading to nutrition, additional nutrition in that area. And the comment from community members, and I wanted to read that before, if one person was sick in our community, we were all sick. Now there's less sickness, less spread of disease, there's more income, there's an opportunity for people to pay school fees, buy medicine, do things they haven't in the past. And the women had commented that when it started as a woman's activity, it was great, but now their husbands are getting up early to get out and weed. I shared this with my husband, who thinks I'm constantly male bashing, so I didn't say it from that perspective, but a really great example of a very practical solution and one that taught people about how to deal with these issues and to use the environment for ongoing sustainability. Second one, though, more of a livelihoods component, is around aquaculture. So most of these communities rely heavily on marine resources, fish, aquaculture. And we worked with our colleagues at ARC, FAO, and others to develop a pamphlet and approach called Better Management Practices, BMP, for small-scale fishing in Aceh. And we were able to work with people on building those aquaculture sites outside of mangroves so that you could keep mangroves strong and resilient and there as buffers for future storms. We're able to teach them about screening water before it came into those pools for shrimp, such that you had to use either fewer or no pesticides and no chemical agents. And I remember one of the meetings that we had a young guy on our staff who's one of our aquaculture specialists come back. I've never seen him more excited about what he does for a living. And he was excited because these communities now were able to use far less inputs. It was really cost effective. They could afford to do things. They were seeing all this great fish and shrimp farming, and they were now getting interest from Western markets that would never touch their product before because of lack of traceabilities, pesticides, chemicals, and that sort of thing. And just really excited about that prospect and what was happening and opening up there. And that rippled out. Our office in Indonesia had not worked on aquaculture in the past, and know that those practices in that book have been extended across Indonesia via our offices, and we have major global players like Costco coming in to look at making investments with small-scale producers in Indonesia post this. So the ripple-on effects of the screening have been quite remarkable. Roger mentioned that we've had an extension of these activities beyond the efforts that we had there immediately. There were a couple of things I'd want to point out. During the project, before the toolkit was completed, 2007 Cyclone Jukwe hit the coast of Mozambique. Really devastating impact in very poor provinces in very poor districts in Nampula province and Gauche and Moma and other places. I know, I think John Randall and other consultants went out using some of what we've done to join there on site selection for shelter, how you would deal with things, and to start testing those tools that we developed. And I just visited there a week or two ago, and we have disaster committees that are in the communities and others, so those things have been embraced broadly. In China, after the earthquake there, we shared some of the tools, trained up our staff and other local partners and CBO organizations on how to deal with these issues. In Chile, after the earthquake and tsunami there, had immediate training of staffs there, and the government of Chile has provided money out into those communities to work on some of the livelihood issues and to do a model project that will be natural risk management reduction activities. And representatives from the Chile Minister of the Environment will be coming here to meet with many partners in this area to be trained up on these environmental issues. And we're hopeful we'll be doing some GERT training with them while they're here. In Haiti, we put an advisor in the UN group that was looking at shelter during that period of time to use some of these tools. So we've been able to expand these efforts even before the publication of the toolkit out into those communities. So I think that's give you some background of why we're excited about this, the kind of legs that it has, and the way in which it has changed our organization. And again, I'd just like to conclude by saying thank you very much to all of our American Red Cross colleagues who allowed us to work on this project together with you. And a lot of the back and forth that it took to make this successful, it was really a privilege, and we look forward to doing additional training and activities with you going forward and think it's a solid basis for us to work together in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm honored and privileged to be here to give some thoughts concerning the role of USAID and how USAID thinks about the integration of environmental issues into our disaster response and planning. For those of you who are not familiar with what a Bureau Environmental Officer is, my role within the agency is to be the environmental impact assessment review professional for a Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. So I have a great appreciation for WWF coming together with American Red Cross because I work within, pardon me, a Bureau of USAID whose focus, as you can imagine, is not on environmental protection. Our focus is on saving lives, serving political transitions for countries, democracy and governance issues, as well as conflict issues. So I have a great appreciation for this strategic partnership because I know something about what it's like to be on the inside working on these issues. So just briefly, I wanted to share some notes with you today to talk a little bit about environmental issues along the relief to development continuum. I want to talk a little bit about USAID's perspectives in that immediate relief scenario. We'll say provisionally up to 3 months after disaster, as well as then the transitional period greater than 3 months and beyond. So again, in that immediate aftermath, the hot zone, if you will, you can imagine again that environmental protection is not the first order of business. Our mandate is to save lives and provide food and non-food assistance, search and rescue, et cetera, et cetera. However, it is well understood by our technical staff within those entities and well appreciated the role that the environment plays in terms of providing life, livelihood, and culture to these affected populations. So again, I want to just share a couple of pieces, even within that hot zone, if you will. USAID has certain pre-planning standards. For example, as you can imagine, as USG's, the U.S. government's first responders for humanitarian assistance, there's a tremendous pressure on us to respond and tremendous pressure on us to work with the American populations to serve the needs of these affected populations. For example, as a matter of course, Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance does not accept donations of bottled water, for example, where there's a tremendous amount of pressure perhaps to have such commodities be accepted, and there might be well-meaning reasons for that, but it's simply not a good idea from multiple perspectives, and it's a matter of course that we don't accept those in lieu of water treatment facilities and jerry cans, et cetera, that can be reused. So that's just a for example, just to share with you. In terms of our operational guidance to look at operational planning during this relief scenario, of course we like other donors, work with the severe international standards for humanitarian actions, as well as our own field operations guide, the FOG, that some of you may be familiar with. And then I'd also like to give note to the highly trained expertise of staff that we have here in USAID Washington, as well as overseas, representing technical expertise across a wide range of disciplines in the humanitarian sector. And those individuals also have built into their way of thinking where it is relevant. Again, the bottled water. For example, in Haiti, our water and sanitation folks would not accept chemical toilets for various different reasons. So within our oversight and expertise for our humanitarian assistance, we have a lot of provisions for environmental protection built in there as well. And staffing on these issues is something I can't emphasize enough. It's wonderful to have good provisions and good procedures in mind, but if you don't have staff that's willing and able to do this work, that's an essential, absolutely essential issue. And I'll touch upon later some key issues that we see in terms of implementation of these issues in the field. From a recovery phase perspective, of course, there's no question during that post-disaster recovery phase, and here we're saying beyond 3 months, that the environment is key concerning the livelihood, and culture of individuals. Again, I think it's no surprise to any of us in the room here that populations rely on their 20 to 50K radius around where they live in a much more severe extent than any of us really in this room can really imagine. So when their environment gets affected, it affects every aspect of their life and their culture going forward. So just quickly in terms of some programs are within my Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, we have some extensive programming in disaster risk reduction. It can be looking into hydrometeorological events related to climate variability and change, also looking into famine risks associated with environmental threats. As you can imagine, we have been in this Bureau looking at the interface of famine and not famine, disaster and not disaster, conflict and not conflict for many, many years, that we've been able to take a step back and say, what are some of the underlying causative agents for that? And that's where some of our disaster risk reduction work, spanning for some 20 to 30 years, has really some excellent lessons learned concerning the core integration of environmental issues into to that end. Again, USAID has an environmental impact assessment process as part of the U.S. government. We can issue environmental impacts assessment at strategic levels, at programmatic levels. We recently completed one for Haiti for the resettlement activities, as well as it is a matter of course for our regulatory requirements that at the project level, all of our programs undergo an environmental impact assessment process, and that is overseen by a series of environmental officers in the field, as well as at various different regions and in the headquarters. So that is an area, again, I'm going to go back to this idea of staffing. It's all well and good to have policies and tools and regulations, but if you do not have the appropriate staffing to provide the oversight to make this work happen, I think all of you can understand that there's going to be a tremendous challenge. Concerning our own operational guidance, we have an environmental guidelines for small-scale activities in Africa, which is applied to other global programs. If any of you are familiar with this, it's an excellent guidance that lays out on a sector-by-sector basis potential environmental impacts as well as mitigation measures. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a lay of some of the tools and approaches that USAID uses, again, in this relief and then moving into the recovery phase. I want to now touch on a couple of key principles for environmental policy implementation. Again, my role is as an environmental officer, and so I've been keenly focused on this bureau for several years now with my other professional colleagues on how do we actually implement some of these issues into the way that USAID does business. So it's key to look at the strategic integration at the design level, as many of you can appreciate, to get these issues in terms of having them not be a sideline issue, but being an issue that is part and parcel of the actual program itself. For humanitarian assistance practitioners, it's important to put these environmental issues into the context from a field perspective as well as from an organizational perspective. Again, going back to the idea of those technical, contextual levels, but then the organizational level is a key facet to ensure success. And then I was really very, very pleased also to see within the GERT, upon my review of it, that they understand the importance of getting these issues into the indicator framework. Again, these are key issues when it comes to implementing these policies and making them real and on the ground phase. And I was quite pleased to see that. And then budgeting for environmental protection issues, and then finally evaluation. So again, the strength that I saw of the GERT was this strategic partnership. When Anita and I met several years ago, I was immediately excited at the idea of having these two very different organizations with very, very different mandates coming together and really trying to seek ways to improve their practices going forward. And only good can come out of that. Two professional organizations coming together, putting their heads together, and so I'm very pleased that such a good outcome has come out of that. There's also a very effective meta-analysis of the pros and cons of different assessment practices. USAID has, in the past, funded the rapid environmental assessment process that's been utilized in many different countries worldwide, and the GERT provides a very useful meta-analysis of various different methodologies and procedures that can be very useful going forward in planning. I will say I want to just raise a couple of issues that, again, understand that I've kind of, I understand some of the challenges that you all have faced in terms of trying to bring these two things together. I wanted to say some challenges that there will be in terms of the implementation of GERT. And those challenges include things like environmental budgeting. Again, I oversee food aid programs, humanitarian assistance programs, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of having some kind of a standalone budget within the actual humanitarian assistance program itself that is going to be dedicated towards these issues. That isn't something that just comes as a matter of course. It's something that has to be fought and refought for on a regular basis. So that is going to be a continual challenge that you will face. And while some of the measures that the GERT will suggest do not in and of themselves perhaps cost more money, where the costs will come in is working with that baseline of practitioners who perhaps don't have the expertise to address these issues. And so again, I commend the GERT in having a rigorous training methodology and a toolkit that can just be readily used, because the need for training will be significant. And again, from that organizational perspective of the turnover in populations in a relief setting, I think many of us who've operated in that setting realize that is a tremendous challenge. So again, the need for that training is going to be pronounced. So from a USAID's perspective about how we could perhaps provide opportunities for utilization of the GERT, again, to look within our own training methodologies to see how we can use the GERT as a training tool for our humanitarian assistance and development relief practitioners. I'll also argue that many of in USAID on the quote-unquote development side of the house would also be able to make quite good use of the GERT. Increasingly, it's not just our humanitarian assistance practitioners that are being pulled into this hot zone of a relief scenario, but it's really some of our development practitioners as well. And so I would encourage sort of you and for us together to think more broadly along that development and relief continuum. And again, I think this could be a very useful tool when it comes to design and planning. Again, because it's laying out the various issues across the different sectors, I could envision various different sectoral experts taking this toolkit. And again, since it's put into such a good context of how a humanitarian assistance organization operates and informing planning. And then finally, we can serve again to help in the communication of this methodology. Again, we supported the rapid environmental assessment. We're very supportive of these issues. But again, I want to just reinforce my where the rubber hits the road. I'm always very interested in how we can actually get the work done. And again, that comes back to staffing and that comes back to training. So I just want to then commend, again, the American Red Cross and WWF for creating this strategic partnership and doing the challenging work of working together. And I look forward to working more closely with you as your team going forward to improve the greening of recovery and reconstruction engagement with partner countries in the aftermath of disasters. Thank you.
Thank you. think if you just hit escape, you'll be able to then click on you.
Okay. Great. My name is Bob LaPrade. I'm the emergency director at CARE, and I've been pretty much asked to come and I think provide an operational perspective on some of these things. How do we actually try to get this stuff out into the field? You know, it's great to see this big giant book that's there, but I think we all know that we have a lot of books on our bookshelves, right? And there's a lot of things there that are competing for our time, competing for our attention, and that type of thing. So how do we actually get this stuff out into the field and actually implement it into our programs?
So,
can you guys hear me?
So the folks online can hear you as well.
Oh, got it. Okay, great. It's good to see the Wilson Center doesn't use plastic bottles.
Well,
because,
it's unbelievable the fights that went into that, as we all know. So this one, right?
Yes. Okay. I have a parent that has some short-term memory loss problems. So we spend a lot of time when I'm with him watching the highly intellectual shows of Wheel of Fortune and Family Feud. Do you guys know that? Yeah? Okay. You guys aren't Dancing with the Stars, folks? No? Okay. All right. Okay. So anyway, I want everybody to kind of think along this. You guys know the Family Feud stuff. 100 humanitarian workers surveyed, right? And what are some of the problems that we're looking at in trying to get some of this stuff done? So here's the situation. Think about this. Huddle in your group, your Family Feud. The situation you were in was horrible. People were devastated. Why did you not incorporate environmental concerns into your project? Think about it. Why not? You're in the middle of everything. Things are horrible. Okay, so what are some of the reasons? The survey said it's not important. Do you think some people think that? I think there are probably some, although maybe not so many. I think people kind of that are out there in the field, they see the connections, they feel the connections, and there are some. But in general, I think most aid workers are more sophisticated than that. I think some people think that it wouldn't have an impact on the people's lives so much. And even more so, too costly. Sometimes they don't have the skills, so they see it. They see the importance. They know that there are these connections, but there are no skills. And a lot of times, I think people just feel that it takes too much time or they're too busy. They're humanitarian workers. They're people that are so focused on saving lives, and they're going, 100 miles an hour. They're going on adrenaline, and they're there to save people's lives. And the environment is just kind of secondary importance, at least in people's minds, I think. I think sometimes people think that, the humanitarians, a lot of times, are the cowboys, doing truck and chuck, kicking stuff off the back of a truck and, doing things like that. But really, I think they're much more sophisticated than that. And they're the ones out in the field, and I think they see those connections. So I think that we kind of have two issues when it comes to this. I think one is the knowledge and awareness. I think some people don't really see exactly what the connections might be to their work, humanitarian workers in the field. They know it's out there. Oh, yeah, those are those long-term kind of environmental, those are those tree huggers. We don't really need them. We're doing more important life-saving things here. So I think part of it is trying to educate workers and actually see what those connections are. And then even if they do know it, they don't know, well, how can I really do something about this? I don't have a lot of time here. Give me some skills that I can quickly put into place to actually make a difference. So I think that's kind of two of the things that are really important. And I'll come back to these in a minute. I do think some of the connections are, when you think about it, the work that's actually being done, as we talked about in the first 3 months, end up connecting to people's long-term well-being. So it's not just about what they're doing now. It is actually about their long-term well-being. it is actually about keeping people alive, not just in the short term, but in the long term. So it really, our work in humanitarian things, in the early phases of an emergency, kind of in that, 1 year down the road, kind of where we are in Haiti right now, where we were in the tsunami not too long ago. Those things that were done early on have direct effects on people's health, on their livelihoods, and on their shelter that they live in and the community. I mean, these are really things that directly impact this. And these are the things when you ask people, I think in general, I mean, there's all kinds of surveys about exactly, what people actually consider important in different emergencies. But in the end, I think people tend to think, I want to be healthy, and I want my kids to be healthy. I need to make a living somehow, and I need a roof over my head. I mean, these are kind of things that just come back again and again and again. So actually, it's really interesting. Marcia kind of already talked a little bit about the kind of some cottage industry stuff that were, people were trying to get this was in Indonesia, people were trying to get back on their feet with livelihoods, and one of the options that they had was this kind of cottage industry gold mining in an area. But a byproduct of that is mercury that they actually used that was going into the water. So, if you're encouraging, for example, if one was encouraging, local cottage industry and business and perhaps providing some inputs into those kind of things, what are going to be the long-term effects on that? What are going to be the long-term effects on your health? Another example is kind of, if you're chopping down trees that normally kind of help with control of standing water and things like that, you actually could be contributing to more mosquitoes and higher incidence of malaria. Kind of on livelihoods, another example that I've kind of seen, which is quite interesting, is in Namibia there was a drought. This was several years ago, but there was a real effort to try to put more water points in to allow livestock to have better access to water and have people for drinking water. But as more of those were put in, it ended up actually depleting the food for the animals around there, and it in the long term it really had some quite negative effects. So these are the kinds of things that can actually happen when one's trying to do that. I'm just going to kind of go through this. A couple of things that are also important, I think, are a lot of the kind of rules of conduct for humanitarian organizations that are out there, like the Red Cross and NGO Code of Conduct, and some of the principles that I think relate directly to the environment. And that's relief aid must strive to reduce future vulnerabilities to disaster, and also avoiding long-term beneficiary dependence on external aid. I think the way that we consider the environment and has great connections to these things in trying to uphold that code of conduct that all humanitarian organizations adhere to. So what do I kind of see for my job at CARE to try to integrate some of these things? I think one is to integrate some of these principles into our own assessment and design tools. Every kind of organization has these things, and how do we try to integrate these GERT principles into that? Another example is actually having some environmental staff kind of working with agencies. I know there are some people in this room that have had experience with that, and that can be highly successful. Some WWF people actually worked at the CARE office in Sri Lanka, or was it Sri Lanka? Someplace. Anyway, I'm new to CARE. I've only been around 2 months. So so that's a really good way of doing that. Also, I think in the cluster system of the UN, trying to get environmental advisors into some of those things are really important. For example, in Haiti, there have been some environmental people involved with a shelter cluster, which is really effective in getting them and thinking about site selection and other kinds of things. It's really important. Also at CARE, we have something called the Humanitarian Accountability Framework that we use for all of our disaster responses, and that looks at things like timeliness, quality, things like that. So how do we make sure that environmental concerns are built into those frameworks? And I think especially we're looking at building staff core competencies. We have emergency preparedness planning that we do at all of our 72 country offices around the world. So how are they building that into those emergency preparedness plans that they're required to update every 6 months or a year? Another is kind of surge staff training. We have these trainings, for example, where basically when an emergency happens, our country, it's a large emergency, let's say in Benin right now with the floods that have been happening there. It was beyond the control of what our country office could actually do, so we had to bring surge staff in from other countries and things like that to deal with it. So how do we make sure those people that are normally kind of development workers, but kind of on the side do humanitarian things? How do we build that into there? Then also we have an emergency leadership training, and that's trying to get the top people to buy into this, because if they're not, then we have problems. Something else that I think is really important is things related to new staff. In emergencies, what often happens with NGOs is you might start out, you have a development program, you might have 50 people on the ground, something like that. A huge emergency happens, and literally within a month you have 500 staff. They're people that you've brought in, they're mostly local staff. Many of them probably have never even worked for an NGO before. So how do you you're working on a lot of principle issues, teaching people about humanitarian principles and stuff like that, but how do you try to integrate and get these concepts in with these people that are totally new, in many cases, to the field? And it's really important. And then finally, I think with local partners is really important too, because, an example, CARE is working in Pakistan right now to respond to the floods totally through local partners, totally through Pakistani NGOs. We have really none of our own staff out there implementing things. So how do we ensure that those local partners have those skills? Some of them we were partners with before, and that's maybe easier, but how do you try to do it when you suddenly have a whole bunch of new partners in the field and you're kind of one step away when it comes to accountability? And I think this is kind of a trend that in the world to use a lot more local partners. So, how do you make sure that those kind of things are integrated? I think that's all I've got. Anyway, thanks. I do want to, because I was with the American Red Cross for 5 years and was very involved with this, I want to give just a little bit of a shout out here to a few people. Elisa Gertner, not Elisa GERT, right here, and Alicia Fairfield right here, who there were many others that were very involved, but those two especially, I mean, they worked really long hours and through all the details and stuff, and as well as all the WWF folks, but Marcia already gave them shout outs. So anyway, thanks a lot.
Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me up. So India asked me if I would try and paint something of the overview. I mean, why actually does this stuff matter in the big view? And coming up from Boston, you always feel a bit sort of like a country cousin coming up to Washington, particularly when there's been so many changes here. So I asked my students, how do I play this one? And they said, for goodness sake, be culturally sensitive. And so their advice was, be evidence-based. This is Washington. Make sure there's political spin in there. Oh, and there better be religious overtones as well. So I want to talk about damnation, purgatory, and Armageddon. So I want to talk about damnation in the present, purgatory in the near future, and Armageddon in the long term. Okay, it's hyperbole, but you sort of get the point that this relationship between the environment and humanitarian issues really matters. It permeates so much of what goes on in environments. This is a picture from Darfur. I took this picture about 25 years ago, when in many ways Darfur was almost an environmental Eden. It was a beautiful place where there was a really complex relationship between the way livelihoods played out, the way the environment changed, the way the economy worked. And it was based on the fact that Darfur is a series of ecological zones. You can imagine in the south it's pretty tropical, it's fairly green. You move up to the middle and you have this sort of savanna area, and you get right up into the north and it's much more sort of almost semi-desert. And if you're going to work in this area as an economy, you have to be able to trade and to move resources and people around. The trouble is that the conflicts that we've had there has essentially broken that trade down, and that conflict has happened in large part because people have not been able to exploit the environment in the way they used to. The trading networks have broken down, and they've had to resort to other resources. So, for instance, this graph is from a survey we did recently, where we basically talked to people right in the north of Darfur. These are the guys that you all know as the Janjaweed, probably. And the blue lines on the graph are how they used to make their living in the past. They were essentially livestock pastoralists. That means you have to be able to travel. You have to have usufruct rights to land. You have to have market networks. As the environment changed, the economy basically broke down, and they were offered only one alternative. The alternative was to take $300 a month as a salaried militia for the government. It actually made economic sense, in other words, to change. So the environmental change was part and parcel of what led to that conflict. And effectively, to use their terms, they talk about a choice of no choice. We can actually die as pastoralists or become pariahs as mercenaries. So this interface between humanitarian action and the environment is really, really close to these sort of people here. These are young lads who basically have very little future. One of the consequences of their actions, and I'm sure you've all seen photographs like this, is that people have been forced into these large IDP and refugee camps from the countryside into these conurbations, where we already know some of the environmental consequences there, the deforestation of the area as people go out to gather fuel wood and bring it in. Ironically, these ladies who are gathering this fuel wood have to actually pay the Janjaweed to gather it because they control the countryside. It's complex. And effectively, it means they are engaging in what are really quite destructive livelihoods. But it's more complicated than that. I mean, we often think of refugee camps and ID camps as looking like this, have been sort of shanty town settlements, or maybe a bit like this, you know, with these little benders. But if you actually look at what's happening now in Darfur, almost all the IDP camps look much more like this. They're essentially urban settlements. And what we've discovered is people are now starting to build these houses out of mud bricks. Mud bricks requires a lot of water to produce them and to build kilns. And in effect, what's now happened is a secondary environmental effect of the water table being drawn around extraordinarily quickly in these areas around the towns in Darfur, generating almost a second environmental crisis. So for an aid agency engaged in humanitarian assistance, it's not enough just to say, is my food aid environmentally friendly? You never know where the environmental problem is going to come up. One disaster, as it were, trickles down into another, and you have to be constantly aware of what's going on. Okay, come on. Okay, so that's the damnation. The guys in Darfur are sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't. Let's talk about purgatory. The amount of money going into humanitarian work around the world has grown vastly over the last decade. So this is going up to about 2008, and as you can probably see, it's about $10 billion a year goes into this stuff. This here divided up between conflict and non-conflict disasters, some of the big country operations. Effectively, a lot of it is around conflict and this mix of conflict and natural disasters. But if you take that graph and you show it differently, so here what we've done is we've gone back into the data and we've percentaged it. So this is sort of showing 100%. And we've looked at whether that spending is going into programs that last for less than 3 years, last for 3 to 8 years, or more than 8 years. And what you actually find is something like 35% of all humanitarian spending doesn't go into quick fix projects. It goes into 8-year programming and longer. 65% of it goes into programs that have been lasting more than 3 years. So in effect, what we've been doing is really trying to find a way of sustaining people in these complex emergencies where you've got fragile environments, you've got this sort of chronic breakdown in public health, pervasive insecurity, and really what you've done is create a state of purgatory. We used to believe that our world in the aid business was divided between sort of the relief on the left and the long-term development on the right, and one would gradually go into the other. We had that relief to development continuum. But the reality is that you have a population, a significant population of millions of people who are effectively trapped in a form of aid purgatory. They're basically on a drip feed. Humanitarian assistance does not get you forward. It keeps you alive. And these, I think, are one of the most telling situations where environmental issues and the ability to program to understand how to maintain and how to best use that environment are essential. And to be honest, most people aren't looking at this yet. So that's the purgatory in the medium term, the next 10 years. Long term, it's about climate change. And the way I've been looking at this, and we've been trying to analyze it at Tufts, is basically by going back in history and looking at previous periods of climate change and saying, what has that done to those societies? So I want to just quickly show you two, partly because they're fun, but they're also good illustrations. I started out my sort of academic life in the early 1980s in Libya, working for Colonel Gaddafi. Doing some interesting things. And this slide I took in the middle of the Sahara, which used to be, about 7,000 years ago, savanna with large lakes, right? And essentially it started drying up. But before it dried up, it was a hunter-gatherer community, and these wonderful rock carvings that you discover on the edge of the sort of sand desert. Basically, this is sort of, I don't know, late Stone Age, early Bronze Age graffiti, basically. But it was a sustainable community. What then happened? You had a major period of environmental change. And this graph shows the amount of mud coming down rivers off West Africa. Basically, the more rainfall there is, the muddier the rivers are. As the rainfall dries up, the rivers get less muddy, and so the graph of turbidity goes down. So you have this about 5,500 years ago, really rapid period of climate change. And when a colleague of mine is doing now archaeological digs in Libya in this area, and what he's discovered effectively is that climate change led to a massive change in society. The hunter-gatherer communities essentially retreated to the oases, became urbanized, became much more structured, life became less healthy, life expectancy went down, and it became more violent. The climate change, in other words, the environmental change, and the inability to, as it were, manage society at the pace of environmental change led to a breakdown in that society. And we see similar things going on if we move forward to the period of the Little Ice Age. And this is from some research done out of Singapore. So, Little Ice Age, middle 1500s through to about 1700s, all got a little bit cooler in Europe. If we look at graphs for sort of overall agricultural productivity, which basically was the economy of those days, and just look at the red line, effectively there's a bit of a lag, but basically the agriculture nosedived and then got to a new norm and gradually built up as the temperature came back up. Then if you go into the historical record, like the parish records across Europe, and you look at trials for violence and criminality, what you discover is that as the economy crashed, the level of violence in society went up. And as the economy started to recover, the level of violence went down. And the correlation coefficients here are much, much stronger than anything you would get if this was just happenstance. So I think the picture we're getting for the long term, as it were, for the Armageddon, though that's far too grandiose a term, is that when you have massive, rapid change in the environment, whether it's triggered by globalization or climate change, this leads to stress in society. And if you cannot adapt at the pace of that stress, that's going to lead to violence, whether it's political violence or outright conflict. So you have got to understand in your programming, whether it's in the immediacy of the first few weeks after a disaster or those first few years after a disaster that helps set the tone for the future, how do I manage this environment in a sustainable fashion? So damnation, purgatory, and Armageddon, therefore, so one merges into the other. It's the same issue throughout. Where does it take us? Well, I think really it takes us to one theme. And in many ways, the toolbox is about this. All the research we've done about how organizations, human organizations, adapt to the future and survive, says there are really two things that drive it. One is knowledge. You need standards, systems, the guidelines that are laid down, the stuff that you capture from your ancestors or from those boring old professors at Tufts University, you have to have that. But on its own, it's not enough. If you can't apply it to context, you actually have to be obsessed about how do I make these guidelines work properly in this environment? How do I tweak it? Because there is no such thing as two similar places in this world. Every crisis you go into is different from the last one. If you don't apply your knowledge intelligently, and that's really what this toolbox is about, you might as well just sit back in Washington and do the programming. So, to follow the theme, redemption, then, for our environmental programs looks a bit like this, changing from being one of these wonderful rogue elephants of an organization that charges forward come what may, to being an elephant that is much more adept and able to dance and to pirouette and to move around and to understand how to apply that knowledge so that you can work with the environment to create sustainable futures. Thanks very much.
Terrific. Definitely a first at the Wilson Center, a dancing elephant, but appropriate given the partners that we have involved in this effort. Thank you all very much for the contributions today. We have an opportunity for discussion, and we have all of our panelists. So why don't we throw it open? And again, just a reminder, if you could let us know who you are as you pose your question, use a microphone that my colleague will bring to you so that we can share this with the folks online as well. So who would like to kick us off in the discussion? The dancing elephant still got him. Carl in the back.
Very basic question. How can we get a copy of this set of information? Is it available online, hard copy? How do we get this?
Okay, thanks. From Carl Brook at ELI. Sky, could you bring it down to Anita? Perhaps it's the best person to answer that question.
There's a flyer on the table outside that has a website where you can go to download the various modules, or you can request a CD-ROM, and we'll send you a CD-ROM or the full 8 pounds of bounded volumes.
Okay, thank you, Anita. I'd like to ask, because I think this really does present a model, if the folks on the panel could reflect on how this worked in terms of two different organizations coming together to tackle these things from the, not necessarily the mechanics, but what did you find that was the tipping point that suggested that you needed to do it, and go through what are certainly the kind of heavy transaction costs of learning about each other and such. So what was it that really motivated it? And then how did, what would you advise, or what advice would you provide, or lessons learned for other groups that want to take on this tougher work of working across organizations and with the very different tools and missions? You have some reflections from the process?
I was going to refer that one to Bob, since you probably have the longest tenure on this project.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the words of advice that I would have is that you have to kind of be in it a little bit for the long term. As you kind of indicated, I think that especially from a humanitarian organization and an environmental organization, I think the outlooks do tend to be different. And I think that understanding how each type of organization kind of operates, and that really was important, and it was really key that they kind of understood the importance and just the background and how they operate. There was a little kind of comic that was going around that showed kind of the humanitarian organization as a little bit of a baby, and then the environmental organization is kind of like, what is it, Father Time or whatever. Basically, with the viewpoints that a humanitarian organization, is thinking like, in days, in weeks, in months, and the environmental organizations are thinking in decades or centuries and that type of thing. So it's really I think it's important on that. As far as the tipping point, I think that we went through some challenges probably in the first year, and I think sometimes wondered, what value added does this bring? And what it really took, in my opinion, were the people in the field that were actually responsible for programs, that were dealing with affected populations immediately, and had the input. For example, I know with the Red Cross staff that had the input directly from WWF staff in the field, and they were actually out in the field together talking about things, and they said, wow, this really can make a difference in the way that I do my programs. And I think it's kind of that drive from the field and the real benefit that those people felt that really made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd add something to that too, because I entered the scene about a year plus into the program, and we were having those initial growing pains, wondering if this marriage would last, and had some very frank discussions among the team about early evaluations and issues. And I think it was both the field enthusiasm, but stepping back also at the headquarters level to really reflect on how differently we operate, and spending time with each other about how things should work, and making sure there was the political capital in the two headquarters locations and the country offices and all to really make it work and have that sort of dialogue. So we examined what we would do again if we could rewind the 5 years, and I think there would have been much more of an upfront effort engaging leaders in those communities more thoughtfully in the first 6 to 9 months around what this meant and what we'd have to do differently to make it work. But it was a very, I think, great adaptive management on the part of both of our organizations, and an openness to talk about those challenges. We had really critical evaluations during that period of time, and if I were going to do this again, I would suggest that people take the same kind of principles I used to use as a consultant working with two merging organizations, to really do that cultural assessment, to think through how you approach projects and be very thoughtful on how you roll it out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Some other, Kendra down here.
Hi, I'm Kendra Sand. So I understand that GERT, it's an international toolkit, but how do you think green recovery and reconstruction issues would be nurtured or challenged in developing versus developed countries, or even rural versus more urban settings? And it kind of goes back to what Peter was saying, that, in his example with the Oasis, people retreated and became a more centered urban community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the develop versus developing, I thought it was notable. We had a number of people from DHS who are looking at these issues in some ways in the United States coming today to gain insights. But any thoughts on differences in those axes? Peter?
I think the urban one is probably the most challenging, because the urban, at least the trends we think we're seeing, is that the fastest growing populations of the world are urban areas, in the south, in cities of less than 1 million, and in the peripheral unplanned areas. Right? So it's essentially those shanty towns that are growing, and most people are coming there because they think there's a better future than somewhere else. You're either fleeing environmental degradation, economic degradation, or war. And what's going on is almost very much an accelerated process in those environments. There's very little research actually being done on how do you move to a form of sustainable development when you can't rely upon government systems or NGO systems or the like, where it's a lot of self-help but organized in an extraordinarily different way, and an environment that's really not the same as it was 10 years ago. One of the things that's been fascinating us is the way access to cell phone technology is changing the way economies work in some of these urban areas. Actually, there's quite a lot of hope there in the future. My take, I think, is that these sorts of guidelines are just as applicable there. It's back to context. You've got to know how to use them. And to be honest, I see no reason why these shouldn't be as applicable to flooding in Boston as they are to flooding in Aceh. The basic parameters are the same. It's just the speed and the mix of processes that are different.
Mm-hmm. Other reflections? Gentleman right behind.
Yes, I'm Gene Owens. I'm with Tetra Tech. I'm an environmental economist, and I was struck by a couple of things by two speakers. One, the issue of the avoiding aid dependency, particularly in the first 3 months, and looking toward potential income generation. But then the slide that Peter brought out, that we're moving toward much longer term relationships in our disaster management, up to 8 years or so. Now, does the GERT 2 book look at the economic issues of, particularly as we face greater climate change threats, where's the money going to come from to keep responding, so to speak? Has that been thought of? Thank you.
All right. Do you want to take it, Nita, or shall I?
There is a module in the GERT on livelihoods, and one of the principles and the premise behind the GERT is to reduce future risk and vulnerability. So if we're able to use it the way it's intended, we won't need to respond to future risk or future calamities. So that's one element of the economics of it. I don't know if that answers your question.
There's maybe a couple of other little twists on it. I mean, you talk about aid dependency. I actually don't know of any communities that are aid dependent anywhere. Most people are quite smart and make smart economic decisions about what resources are available. And if an aid resource is available to survive, it's probably a smart decision to use it. And there's certainly no evidence that people will choose that over trying to build a longer-term future. So the issue is, how do you open up those longer-term futures? Most of these long-term humanitarian operations are in places where there are high levels of conflict, and that sort of dispersed, sort of terrorist-style, guerrilla-style conflict going on. What we haven't figured out yet is our development models, for the most part, rely upon the assumption that there is stability. In other words, the developmentalists will wait until there's a stable environment. That means in Somalia you've been waiting for 20 years. And that's just, for me, just ethically not on. So the challenge is, how do you take these sorts of guidelines and figure out a third way of working? This is not relief. It's not classical development with the economics that come from having stable systems and good governance. This is a new type of environment to work in. Anybody wants to do the research?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, Jeff in the middle, and then we'll work on that side.
Thank you, everybody. My name's Jeff Plotz of the Cloudburst Group, and for close to 10 years now, I've been working with USAID on environmental compliance. And a lot of all the modules here are relevant beyond not just from the immediately following a disaster. But over the years working with aid and implementers, there's always a need for training, and with the wonderful tools that are captured in the GERT, I'm wondering how the organizations, and to what extent they've institutionalized these toolkits into their current staff, and what the plans are for training existing staff and future staff, and thoughts for rolling it out, not just as it was stated earlier, so it's not just a toolkit sitting on the shelf.
I'll start. I mean, I'm not the program staff, but what I will say is that we're already looking. We believe that some of the work that we're going to do in Haiti will be guided by the GRRT principles, and so that it's. I can assure you that we're not using it as something that goes on the shelves. It would break all the shelves that we have at the Red Cross. So the development is important to us, and utilization of it in our response is important. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to talk any more detail about how we're using that.
Yeah, so we can get you a microphone if one of those Red Cross colleagues would like to.
I don't necessarily have much more detail, but yes, Haiti so far has been informed by the GERT and what we've learned from tsunami, and they're also in discussions of potential partnership work with WWF. That's to be determined, but it's being discussed. And also, Anita and I are presently working on trying to put together a first training for the humanitarian sector, maybe hopefully sometime in January or February, but we'll send out a notice once that's confirmed.
Yeah, maybe I can also just add that, I mean, I think you've kind of hit on exactly what the next challenge is for this, and how is it that we roll it out to the hundreds of humanitarian organizations that respond to emergencies and then work in the recovery process. I mean, there are some examples of how this kind of thing has rolled out in the past and effectively, like the SPHERE guidelines that many of you probably know about. In addition to that, there are things like the education and emergencies standards that are kind of not part of SPHERE, but are kind of a side type guidance document. So, you know, how that has kind of rolled out and got just some legs on it as far as understanding and importance, and then has kind of built a global constituency on that is really important. And I think beyond just kind of the INGOs that are dealing with it, I think, you know, and then beyond that, or even the local NGOs, especially in developing countries, and, you know, how all that's dealt with, because that's a whole other thing with, you know, dealing with local languages and what does it mean for the local context and all that type of thing. But anyway, that's one day for the future.
And I could comment for WWF. Ours has been more of a viral effort. Immediately after the Pakistan floods, our CEO received a call saying, "May I have Anita? Or can I get some people from the team to get out here?" Same with China, same with Chile and others. So at the institutional level, there's a general awareness of this activity. We have not as aggressively pushed it out into our organization, 110 locations around the world, and to local partners the way that we should. And I agree with Peter with this comment that this isn't just in that initial phase disaster piece. When we first started looking at it, we commented it's good for development efforts. So we need to start reflecting on how we're going to more consciously do that. And I know we have an internal review going on right now about all of our people, conservation, livelihoods efforts, and how we do that in the next phase. So it's interesting to hear all these comments to think about how we make that more a part of what our organization does.
Anita, you want to elaborate on that?
Just a quick follow-up. That's a very good question, and we're open to ideas as well. Each module is meant to be a standalone one-day training, and there's a very detailed trainer's guide there. So any good trainer should be able to pick that up and use that, and we hope that that will happen. And we're hoping that you will register on that website and be a member of the GERT community, because what we really want to do as well is learn how it's being used, what challenges are faced, so that we can continually evolve and adapt and improve the practices. And we're looking for partners who would like to work with us over the years to roll this out and develop the capacity within our institutions and our partner institutions, so that we can build hopefully a global community of GERT trainers who have the experience at a level that can then replicate it in their own areas. So again, we're open for ideas and would love to hear suggestions.
Okay.
Just so you know, this here is, these are just the guidance notes that go with it, each of these things, and there's a whole set of the stuff on the CDs with very detailed training modules and things like that, so that it's basically ready to use for a lot of training things. So those of you that are in operational organizations, it's really kind of really ready to use stuff. It's great.
Okay, lady back here, and then we'll move across. Yep.
Hi, I'm Laura Henderson with WWF, and I had a question for Erika Clesceri. You mentioned that if you don't have the appropriate staff to make environmental guidelines happen, that there can be really significant challenges, and also that you were sort of poised to help communicate this methodology. And it seems that we have ahead of us perhaps quite an important advocacy and awareness work to be done with a variety of donors as well as other organizations. And I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts about whether vis-a-vis potentially with Administrator Shaw, for example, there might not be some congruence of some of the things that he's spoken about with great interest of seeing and funding some things that are quite innovative that perhaps might bring in public-private partnerships. And also he's expressed a lot of interest in getting a bigger, more sustainable bang for the buck. And it does seem as if, work on the environment could absolutely show many ways that humanitarian aid could be used in a much more effective way to give a much bigger, more sustainable bang for the buck. So just thought it'd be interesting to hear some of your ideas on some of these advocacy challenges ahead.
Thank you for that question. From the perspective of the GERT as a methodology to explore for greater innovation and greater learning on, for example, starting from how we do a vulnerability assessment to how do we do the implementation going forward, I think that there's definitely room for exploration along those lines. I certainly cannot commit to anything specific, but it's also part of this longer-term engagement that we have had with Anita, and as Jeff mentioned, he was the convener on Monday for a session that we had, a stakeholder analysis of some 40 or so individuals from conservation NGOs, humanitarian assistance NGOs, from the UN, from the World Bank, of course USAID, looking at this interface between humanitarian assistance, climate change and its stressors, as well as impact assessment. And so how I see it, there are many different approaches and tools that are out there to carry this type of work out. But provisionally, the GERT does offer real strength in terms of getting into the actual implementation of the program. Clearly there's a training need and a staffing need, and so I think this is absolutely something that we can look, and my colleagues and I, through various other different types of programs, are considering these types of opportunities. So that's about all I can say at this point, but thank you for that question.
Part of what I thought was particularly useful, too, was just the reflection in some of these sessions that Erika referred to, was that you had different parts of aid in the room who don't always talk with one another or cooperate well. And I think there is, at least from my specific vantage point, there's much more willingness to do that. There's often been the recognition of the importance and the linkages of the issues, but there seems to be more political space within the building to actually do some of those collaborations.
Yeah,
and, so
and certainly under the climate change stressor, it's really permitted us to look more broadly about how do we seek to reduce vulnerability, which is the particular aspect that my bureau would be curious about. How do we mobilize physical and social science expertise, democracy and governance issues, perceptions of legitimacy and transparency, conflict issues with the technical early warning systems for climate change, hydrometeorological disaster risk reduction, and so things along those lines to bring those physical and social science capabilities is a really exciting area that we're looking into as well.
Okay. There are a couple more across the back, then we'll come in the middle and Ken.
Hi, my name's Jessica Tufty, and I'm an intern with the American Association for the Advancement of Science and their Science and Human Rights program. And we have an on-call scientist program where we basically already have an established list of certified scientists of all sorts looking to be put into positions that your guide seems to be instructing about. And I mean, just listening to everything you're saying, answering all these questions, it seems to fill an important niche. And I'm just wondering who I can talk to here that would be interested more in hearing about that and how there might be use in being able to just take these scientists who are already wanting to do it and just don't have the means of finding who to communicate with.
Well, I think Anita Von Breda, right down here, will gladly take your card and follow up on the conversation. Yeah, right down the row there.
Hello, my name is Elena Barona. I work for the government of Chiapas in Mexico. And I was wondering, you were talking about this toolkit as a disaster guideline, but I don't know if this toolkit can be used, for example, for a government as a guide for sustainable development in poor communities.
Talk about how far up that development continuum we want to venture with the resource.
Yeah, we see disaster response, recovery, and reconstruction as a form of development. And as Peter was saying, it's all about the context, but we think the same principles apply to just good, sustainable development. So I think it could be used in that context. It may need to be tailored a bit to the local specifics, but it is, in our view, good green development.
Okay. And I tell you that at WWF, we work very closely with Julia Carabias around Chiapas projects and all, so we can make sure that we connect up with Julia on these pieces, too, to see if there's anything that is particularly relevant for you.
Yeah, and I mean, the principles and guidance that are in it were actually developed more during a recovery period from a large-scale disaster over about 5 years. It also is not necessarily focused on NGOs. They're definitely things that could be applied by governments as well. So.
And then I would encourage you, also I made passing reference to the USAID guidance on environmental guidelines for small-scale activities. If you're familiar with that, there's also aspects that get into cleaner production in terms of small microenterprise along those lines and pollution prevention that may be of interest.
Okay. Terrific. Ken in the middle, Ken Conca.
Ken Conca, American University. I had a question about community-based natural resource management as part of this, and the tension between looking backward and trying to capture traditions and foundations that exist in society for how to manage natural resources and resolve conflicts around natural resources, allocate resources, etc., versus the loss of that in the context of disaster or in a war zone. It seems like if we've learned anything in the last 20 years, it's that those community-based practices are going to have to be central foundations of sustainability, culturally based practices, traditional dispute resolution mechanisms, etc. It's this enormous array of social capital that exists anywhere you're going to be working in one form or another. On the other hand, that's one of the casualties of disaster. That's one of the casualties of conflict. And so it's a tough question, I guess, and it's kind of an open-ended question. I'm just wondering, are there principles, are there opportunities you've seen, are there cautionary tales about how you navigate that boundary between trying to reclaim and rebuild in what's a very different context where people are out of place, they're out of community, and so on and so forth. So should we be thinking of this mainly as an exercise in trying to rebuild those social foundations for natural resource management, or establish very new ones because we've sort of crossed a watershed in the wake of disaster or conflict?
I was just going to comment with respect to how these things were applied in this project. So I don't know that there was necessarily the conscious thinking with respect to that, except that the activities were done in engagement with the communities. And a lot of the development that you heard and the projects you heard were drawing upon what you could from what those communities have had in the past and some of the traditions and other practices they had, and then adding in new approaches and activities. We just spent yesterday at WWF, we had Eleanor Ostrom come to address us on a variety of activities we have around CBNRM. And somebody used the word replicate here earlier, and she told me never to use that word again. It should be struck from the lexicon, because you can't replicate necessarily. And this toolkit isn't meant to be a one-size-fits-all, entirely unique, as Peter, Erika, and others set out here. And I don't know that we've had the theoretical study the way that you're talking about, or really thinking about that as much as we might. But I know in practice, we certainly did it in consultation with those communities very aggressively and actively, and drew what we could from their own experience and guidance in making these things work.
If I could just add on to that, I mean, we've done work exactly on these themes in West Africa, in Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Afghanistan. And in a sense, it's this old issue of you take the knowledge, but then you adapt to the new context. So the systems that were worked out in Darfur over the last 200 years to manage the environment work great as long as the basic parameters don't change. But the basic parameters are changing. You know, we have WTO regulations now that we didn't have before. We have oil. So the trick is to understand that people are pretty smart about managing their environment, but there are things they don't know that you can bring in. So it's a matter of how do you build that partnership. So it's you take the depth of knowledge that comes from the history, if you like. And we see this with local justice systems as well, with systems for dealing with land disputes. You have to take that and then work with that knowledge, and those people say, well, therefore, what has changed that makes this either inappropriate or need to be tweaked? The hardest thing I've found is getting Western-trained scientists and sociologists to slow down and listen and understand that partnership isn't about sitting back and feeling sanctimonious and not listening. Partnership is truly about starting from the assumption that actually you know nothing and you're probably wrong. If you can start with that, then actually you can do some really exciting things, combining old knowledge systems and new high-tech and new systems. It can be great fun.
Judy, in the middle.
Thanks very much. I'm Judy Oglethorpe from WWF, and I just wanted to add to this because you did mention conflict as well as disasters. And I think we have a lot of experience of how resilient communities can be when they go through a huge disaster or a big conflict. In places like Nepal, for example, we saw people, communities coming through the Maoist problems and remaining very resilient, the community forest user groups, for example, surviving all of that, remaining strong, despite, some things had to slow down during the conflict. But as the country emerged out of conflict, those groups, in many cases, becoming stronger than ever. And because they had come together around managing forests, they were also able to take on all sorts of other aspects of community life, sort of including, for example, improving health services and this kind of thing. From experience that I had in Mozambique, where I think that the level of conflict was more intense and the communities were actually very often displaced for a while, those structures came back, the old chiefs were sort of still there and so on, but because the people had been displaced and the conflict had been that much worse, it was more difficult for the people to come back and organize around their resources kind of in time to save them in what was happening in the sort of post-conflict situation. At that time, the private sector mobilized very, very fast. So, local loggers, local hunters would come in and they were taking out those resources that the communities had previously been organized enough to control. So I think it's really important to try to whatever we can do, whether it's a disaster or a conflict, try to support the community structures and empowering communities immediately afterwards. And you asked about opportunity. I think immediately after a huge shock like, a big tsunami or a big war or something, there's also a really good opportunity to do policy reform on outdated policies that may be stopping communities from effectively managing their own resources. So bringing in new laws that enable community-based natural resource management, whether it's coastal systems or forests or whatever. So there definitely are opportunities, and I think also the whole thing of building back greener is just incredibly important. So making sure that that's in there from the start, in order to make sure that things will be more sustainable in the future. So thank you.
Okay. This guy, there's a question down here in front. The yellow scarf.
Thank you for the thoughtful presentations. My name is Monica Kurdeman from the World Resources Institute. Leaving off with redemption, in the world of redemption, none of us will have a job because we will all have built the capacity of people on the ground to deploy the GERT system. So what is your long-term vision of the GERT and building local capacity of the people living in these situations who actually have to live through these crises, as climate change takes shape probably more frequently than not. So do you have a long-term vision of the GERT and how that might be deployed?
And can I ask, kind of piggyback on that, kind of halfway to that long term or a step in that long term? I mean, we have two real heavyweight organizations in your respective fields. Do you have the opportunity to talk to your fellow large-scale organizations, the international organization kind of context as well, to really have them so they don't have to replicate this whole experience themselves, but can live from you on the way towards getting to that end state? So there's clearly the folks who want to go deploy it and use it, but also a number of you stressed the importance of high-level political support within these organizations from the start as being critical. How do you build that on the way to really achieving these ends?
I mean, you're right. I mean, from the standpoint of the American Red Cross, we've got the entire federation, the national societies in so many other countries. This is a tool that we need to share with them as well, and so that they're not reinventing the wheel and are able to leverage the work that's done through this partnership.
Similarly, we're starting to roll that out, but I'd say we have a lot of factors that are trying to come into this long-term vision right now that include climate change, adaptation, how this fits in so many areas, and how we begin to build networks for knowledge sharing that do transfer or draw from really amazing local experience. So in addition to the GERT and the rollout, so it's nascent. We're just launching today. We'll see where we go from there. We also have something that Judy in the center of the room is involved with called our ELAN Network, Ecosystem Livelihood and Adaptation Network, which was launched with the generosity of the MacArthur Foundation and assistance from the World Bank and other bilateral governments right now, which is intended to be a series of nodes around the world and talking about how people are dealing with adaptation, resilience, and other things. And I can see where these two activities could come very naturally together, and sharing both the experience of how do we learn from, share, and build networks that the GERT network and the ELAN network coming together. We need to make sure that those things are very well integrated so that we begin to draw upon those experiences and larger communities of practice, because we obviously don't know it all, and there are going to be some incredible innovation and experimentation out there that we need to find ways to share. So don't have the vision, have the idea for how we bring a lot of voices to the table to shape that.
Carl, in the back.
Carl Brook again. I was curious if the panelists could talk about unintended consequences. What are the major types of unintended consequences of Reconstruction that you see, and how do you deal with them? One of the things that we saw, for instance, in Afghanistan was building roads led to land grabbing, and trying to think about what are it's hard to foresee what the unintended consequences are, but given the breadth of experiences that you've looked at, what are the types of unintended consequences that you typically see? And then how can we learn from that or prepare for these unintended consequences? Thank you.
Yeah, why not? Of course, it's an oxymoron, isn't it? If it's unintended, you can't know about it. Right? Okay, so with hindsight, there are a few examples. The drawdown on the water table in Darfur was one. It's amazing. You would do no urban development in the West without doing a proper survey, first of all, about water resources. You just would never do it. It would be illegal, right? Yet we allowed literally tens of thousands of houses to be built in 1 year in a very small area, and whoosh, down goes the water table, yeah? With all the knock-on consequences that had. You mentioned Afghanistan. We've just completed a piece of work looking at a variant upon humanitarian operations, the U.S. military Hearts and Minds campaigns, which in theory are programmed to reduce conflict and to increase security. The unintended consequence, because of the way they have been programmed up until very recently, is actually the opposite. That they have fueled bad governance, corruption, and in fact have fueled insecurity. And most army commanders know this, but are under political pressure to spend very quickly. So as a job, you see these things later. There is an upside. Often there are unintended consequences which are good. We did some work recently looking at actually some of CARE's gardening projects in Zimbabwe. They were programmed as a sort of nutritional thing. How do we improve nutrition in villages? What we discovered when we did a sort of participatory impact assessment of these was that the real reason they were valued was because they generated income at a time of year that allowed people to buy school uniforms, which allowed their kids to go to school and invest in the future. Nobody would normally have measured the projects in those terms. So I think what happens in this is, if you take the time to really try and unpack the consequences of an operation, not just the impact you expect it to have. Because this is the thing, if you think this project is about improving nutrition and you go to measure nutrition, that's all you'll learn about. Whereas if you go in with an open-ended sort of methodology, which basically says what's changed and to what could that change be attributed, then you start to pick up on these unintended consequences. And it's an iterative process. It allows you to learn. But it means that you really do have to be fairly obsessed by this notion that you know a lot less than you thought you knew. Yeah.
A couple of examples. I'm thinking from the tsunami in particular. There was right for probably the 6 months after the tsunami, of course, a lot of the communities that were affected were fishing communities. And a lot of organizations kind of thought, well, providing fishing boats, many of which were destroyed, and fishing nets and things like that would be a good thing because they're fisher folk, and that's what they were used to, and it would be a very appropriate thing to provide that. But it wasn't only kind of small fishing boats and nets that were provided. There were also some larger ones. And I think some of these kind of studies are ongoing, but there was really a concern that there was an over supply of those things. And in fact, there was a concern that it may lead to overfishing, in fact. So that's kind of an example where the intent was to actually help with people's livelihoods and get them back on their feet. But which may have been the case initially, but in the end, is it really going to deplete the fishing resources and people's ability to survive? So
there's unintended consequences with absolutely every project that we engage in, and it's something that I think oftentimes the things that tend to fall out tend to be these interdisciplinary types of ideas. For example, conflict can be pervasive throughout everything, but if it's a food security outcome, as my colleague said, you're not necessarily going to be thinking about the conflict aspect. I think a real strength is to try to look at our problems, which are integrated and interdisciplinary in their nature, with integrated solutions. Now, that's much more challenging to do than it is actually to say, but I still firmly believe it, that we need integrated solutions for integrated problems. And I think a lot of strength that we can avoid some of those unintended consequences. And first of all, the environmental impact assessment methodology and process utilizes a life cycle analysis process, looking at the beginning, middle, and end projected end of a project, what goods and services are needed for the project, what are some waste streams that might come out of it, and if you then extend that into really, again, putting yourself into that local context and thinking, if this were in my backyard, what are the types of things that I would be concerned about? And very, very quickly, the physical sciences and the social sciences come to bear. Unfortunately, why many of these things tend to slip through is because for various reasons, we tend to focus on sectoral-based programs. There's the impression that you can achieve greater results, or at least more discrete results, and be able to therefore report back to either whoever might be opening up your funds for that particular outcome. But I think it's something that we all really have to push hard in and amongst ourselves in our own sort of methodologies and approaches to really, it puts us outside of our comfort zone is what it does. And so how we can get around being outside of that comfort zone is forming these strategic types of partnerships. Again, within our bureau, we're putting together people who have never spoken to each other, for example, I don't mean personally, but I mean in a technical sense of democracy and governance, professionals, an office of highly educated, PhDs who work in this area, but then putting them together in a room with someone that's thinking about climate change and thinking about local systems for adaptation and dropping down some of these data in a very localized type of setting, thinking about things in a different way. Interdisciplinary groups are always, in my mind, going to get you a better solution to the end, but the risk is that they take more time. And again, we have cultural issues, for example, between the two organizations represented here. So again, I'll say again, I commend you because I know it was not easy, and I saw some of the growing pains going through, but it's absolutely worth it.
Okay. We had a final question down here.
Thank you all for your excellent comments. My name is Leslie Schaefer. I'm curious, following on to this last bit here, if any of you will be involved in, or if you know of any longitudinal studies to look at these issues, perhaps specifically coming out of the tsunami, or where these principles are being applied elsewhere. One of the challenges is really looking back 10 years, but maybe in a more organized fashion. Thank you.
Sounds academic.
Okay.
Sounds academic. Yeah. I used to work in the aid business for years, and the way you damned somebody was by saying they were academic. So there are very few. A lot of these are essentially livelihood studies, right? And almost all the livelihood studies are one-offs, which is a real problem. We have a number starting. We've just started a piece of work in Ethiopia, where we're now in year 3, and essentially we're going to spend 6 years tracking the seasonal changes in people's livelihoods, and actually sort of sneakily on the side tracking aid agencies to see if they learn anything over that time. Potentially with the American Red Cross, the Federation, we may have a project starting in Haiti doing a similar thing. I really, again, stand back and say what changes over a number of years, and then to what can you attribute that. And then I know of one study that started a year ago in Pakistan and is trying to track these changes. But you're right, it's a desperately barren area. Yeah.
I don't mean to be trying to get into a different sector here of academics, but I have to say you did make me start to think about some of the work that USAID has. If any of you are familiar with the Famine Early Warning System, it brings together, at this point we have maybe about 25 years of data in various different food insecure countries globally. And getting back to the climate change piece, what we have been able to start to do is to downscale some of the global climate change models by putting them on the basis of having a greater understanding of the livelihood structure in a particular country and which components of that livelihood are particularly sensitive to climate change. And by virtue of having, say, this 25 years of data in this food insecure country across a range of different food security parameters, we've been able to do some hindcasting on particular famine-related events. The idea being we have this data set, we can do some correlations and kind of go forward with our on the field, on in the ground presence as well. So that's something that might be of interest.
Terrific. Well, we've come, unfortunately, to the end of the appointed time, and so we need to formally sign off, but I know we will have opportunity to continue these conversations. I think getting in touch with Anita so that you can receive a copy of the toolkit, but I think most importantly, be able to stay in touch so that the partners can know how you're using them, to what effect, what kind of ongoing learning as part of that process can be done, and hence I too would urge you to go to the website and become part of this network and really tap into these rich resources. So please join me in thanking our panelists and the two organizations for all the hard work and what is clearly going to be a very valuable a toolkit for going forward on these important issues. So thank you very much.